The ocean stretched endlessly, a restless silver under the morning sun. Waves slapped the wooden hull of the ship as if warning them, "This land, it is not yours yet." Captain John Smith wiped the salt from his brow and stared at the distant shoreline. "Keep your eyes sharp," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've no idea what waits for us." The men murmured among themselves, some excited, some trembling. There was fear, yes, but also hope. Hope that this new land would be their home, that here they could build something lasting, something real. As the ship grounded on the muddy banks of Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, the air smelled of wet earth, brine, and uncertainty. Every plank creaked under the weight of ambition. It was here that their story would begin. Slowly, messily, human, imperfect. The ocean stretched endlessly, a restless silver under the morning sun. Waves slapped the wooden hull of the ship as if warning them, "This land, it is not yours yet." Captain John Smith wiped the salt from his brow and stared at the distant shoreline. "Keep your eyes sharp," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've no idea what waits for us." The men murmured among themselves, some excited, some trembling. There was fear, yes, but also hope. Hope that this new land would be their home, that here they could build something lasting, something real. As the ship grounded on the muddy banks of Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, the air smelled of wet earth, brine, and uncertainty. Every plank creaked under the weight of ambition. The shoreline was uneven, marshy in places, and the reeds whispered in the wind like secrets they didn't intend to share. The men jumped onto the soil, boots sinking into mud that smelled sharp and alive. Some stumbled, some laughed nervously. Captain Smith's eyes scanned the horizon. "Build quickly," he said. "The river is calm now, but it changes. Always it changes." Nearby, Thomas, a young settler with freckles dusting his cheeks, dropped his pack and stared at the forest edge. "Do you think anyone lives there?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. Smith glanced at him, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Perhaps, perhaps not. Either way, respect it. This land does not bow to anyone." The settlers started unpacking, timber for huts, supplies for the long months ahead. Some worked silently, some cursed the weight of the crates. Sweat mixed with the salty air, dripped down necks, ran into eyes. Even as they struggled, there was laughter. A joke here, a grunt there, the kind of raw human energy that comes when fear and hope collide. Every movement carried tension. A slip could mean injury, or worse, an early death in a place far from the world they knew. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shifted across the uneven ground. Birds screamed, insects buzzed. The river moved slowly, a mirror to the sky, hiding currents underneath that could snatch a careless boot or a small rowboat. Captain Smith called them together by the riverbank. "We'll mark out the first huts here," he said. "Water close, timber close, but watch yourselves. This place tests patience and courage alike. It is not a gentle land." And so they began, hammering and digging and hauling with hands blistered before the day was half done. Sweat, mud, and the sharp scent of the river mixed with the salt spray from the ocean. Every settler knew deep down that this was not just about survival. It was about claiming a foothold in history. Every mistake, every triumph would echo in years to come, and none of them could yet know what the river, or the forest, or the people already here would demand in return. By late afternoon, the first frame of a hut stood, crooked, uneven, but stubbornly upright. Samuel, a man with a deep scar on his left cheek, leaned against the post and spat into the mud. "It's a hard life already, and the night hasn't even begun." Nearby, Mary, who had accompanied a husband or brother, none knew her fully, adjusted the cloth over her hair. She looked out at the river with quiet apprehension. "Do you think we'll survive the winter?" she asked herself more than anyone. Some of the men chuckled. "If the mosquitoes don't eat us first, perhaps." Their laughter was brittle, forced, a thin shield against fear. As the sun lowered, long shadows crept across the riverbank. The The forest behind the settlers rustled, alive with hidden things, unknown animals, whispers of the wind through the trees, the eerie hum of insects beginning their nightly chorus. The men paused, each feeling that pull of doubt, that tickle in the spine that told them this land would demand more than they thought. Captain Smith watched them, silent, thinking of the reports that had brought them here, the promise of fertile soil, abundant fish, and a new beginning. All of it true, yes, but the river, the forest, the soil, they did not give themselves willingly. Nothing here would be simple. By dusk, fires flickered. Smoke curled into the sky, visible to anyone or anything that might be watching. The settlers ate a meager meal. Salt pork, stale bread, and water from the river poured through cloth to filter the worst impurities. Conversation was sparse. Eyes darted to the woods and river. Every sound, the snapping of a twig, the flap of a bird's wings felt amplified, a signal, a warning. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Some could not sleep at all. They lay huddled in the huts, listening to the wind, the river, and the distant call of an owl. In those moments, each realized the fragile thread by which they clung to life. One wrong step, one wrong decision, and none of this would matter. Captain Smith sat awake a while longer, staring at the dark water. The reflection of stars danced across the surface. "We are small," he murmured, "against this world, but small does not mean powerless, not yet." The night was long. The forest whispered secrets the settlers could not understand. Yet by dawn, the first light caught the river, the muddy banks, the uneven huts, and something stubborn in the hearts of those who had survived the first day. They were here. They had claimed the beginning. Dawn came slowly, creeping over the river and the marsh. The huts they had built looked fragile in the new light, casting long, uneven shadows across the muddy ground. The men and women moved quietly, their bodies stiff from yesterday's labor, their eyes scanning the horizon for threats unseen. Thomas, the young freckled settler, knelt by the river, dipping his hands into the cold water. He looked at his reflection, unsure if the man staring back was the same who had arrived yesterday. Fear, exhaustion, and hope mixed together in his gaze. Captain Smith walked among them, inspecting the huts, the tools, the beginnings of a small garden. "Keep your edges clean," he said. "Every detail matters. You think the forest sleeps? It does not. Every corner hides life. Every shadow moves. Respect it." Samuel spat again, muttering under his breath. "This place doesn't care about man or women. It just is." His words were heavy, but not bitter. They were a warning to himself as much to the others. By mid-morning, the settlers had managed to raise a few more structures. The air smelled of wet timber, mud, and the smoke of small cooking fires. Children, if any were present, clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and silent. The adults' hands were raw, the work relentless, but the spirit to survive was stronger than their weariness. Thomas spoke softly to a companion. "Do you think we'll ever feel at home here?" His voice wavered. "Or will this land always feel like it's testing us?" Mary, who had been tending to a small fire, looked at him and sighed. "Home? Maybe one day, but not yet. Not while we're learning its rules." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and wet earth. The reeds along the marsh bent and whispered. Captain Smith glanced toward the tree line, eyes narrowing. "Listen carefully," he said. "Every sound, every movement is information. Treat it as such. Ignore it at your peril." Lunch was a brief affair. Salted meat, a handful of bread, a few roots from the forest floor. Some chewed silently, others tried to make small talk, but the tension lingered, like a thick fog. No one wanted to admit how much this land weighed on them. Afternoon came with a flurry of activity. The men and women dug, carried, hammered. Every hut was crooked at first, every garden patch uneven, but progress was made. Sweat ran freely, soaking clothes, streaking faces. A careless footstep could twist an ankle. A dropped tool could pierce a hand. Danger was real, even in the mundane. As the sun began to lower, the sky turning pale gold. The settlers paused. Captain Smith looked at what had been accomplished. It is enough for today. Not perfect, not complete, but it is enough to hold. Tomorrow we build more. We survive. And slowly we learn this land. That evening, fires burned brighter against the darkening sky. The forest pressed close, its noises sharper, more insistent. Somewhere a bird shrieked. A distant splash in the river made heads turn. Hearts beat faster. Every sense was alert. Survival demanded nothing less. In the dim light, Thomas knelt near a fire and whispered a prayer. He did not know if anyone heard, but it mattered that he spoke it. Mary sat beside him, her hand brushing against his shoulder, offering what small comfort she could. Silence held them together, a fragile shield against the unknown that waited beyond the light. The night deepened. Stars blinked cold and distant. Captain Smith, sitting apart from the others, scratched in a small notebook. Names, tasks, observations, anything to keep order in the chaos. He thought of the months ahead, the winters, the storms, the possible attacks. He thought of the mistakes they could not yet foresee. And yet he also thought of the determination, the stubbornness of these settlers, and he allowed himself a small, rare smile. They were alive, they were here, and they were not defeated. Hours passed. The forest murmured. The river moved, slow and patient, hiding its currents. Fires crackled, shadows danced, and the settlers, tired, hungry, uncertain, found a rhythm in their exhaustion. Every breath, every heartbeat was a small victory. As dawn approached again, Captain Smith rose. The river reflected the first hints of light. "This land tests all of us," he whispered to himself. "It will break the weak and teach the strong. And we will learn. Slowly, imperfectly, but we will survive. We must." The settlers slept in shifts, always alert, always listening. The wind, the river, the forest, they were alive, always observing. Yet despite the fear, despite the unknown, there was pride in the human effort laid upon this soil. By the third day, the first huts were standing sturdily. A small garden patch promised vegetables. The settlers had learned a rhythm, however fragile. Confidence grew. Each step was still uncertain, each breath measured, but slowly the land began to yield to their persistence. Captain Smith looked across the settlement, eyes lingering on each face. Fear remained, yes, but now, alongside it, a spark of something else. Hope, courage, the stubborn pulse of survival. The river reflected their labor, the huts, the small fires, the long shadows of men and women who dared to dream. And though danger still waited, hidden in reeds and forests, they had claimed their beginning. They had arrived. They had not faltered. And this hard, relentless, beautiful struggle was the story they would carry forward. Imperfect, human, and strong.
The morning sun fell softly on the small settlement. The hut stood as quiet testimony to the settlers' labor, but beyond the river and the forest lay a world they did not yet understand. The land was not empty, it was alive, and it had its own people. Captain Smith called a meeting at the riverbank. "We are not the first here," he said, voice steady but heavy. "Respect and caution must guide our steps. The people of this land, our neighbors, are skilled. They know the river, the forest, the seasons. Ignore them at your peril." Thomas, still young and wide-eyed, listened carefully. He had seen glimpses of movement at the forest's edge, shadows flitting between trees, shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. His stomach tightened. "Do they watch us?" he whispered to Mary, who stood nearby. Mary's lips pressed together. "Perhaps, perhaps not, but they will notice everything we do, every hut, every fire, every footstep. And we must learn to live alongside them, whether they like it or not." The settlers began exploring the surrounding land. They encountered trails that were clearly made by human hands, not animals. They found remnants of earlier camps, fire pits, sharpened stakes, signs that life had existed here long before their arrival. It was Thomas who first approached a small clearing. He crouched, studying footprints in the mud. "They move like the river," he said softly, awe and fear in his voice. Silent, careful, always watching, Samuel snorted but did not argue. "Good," he said, "we'll watch too, and we'll learn, but never think this land owes us kindness." The days passed with labor, but each step brought the settlers into quiet encounters. Occasionally they glimpsed figures across the river, just beyond the forest's edge. They did not approach, but their presence was undeniable. A bow strung, a bird calling, a shadow slipping between trees. Captain Smith arranged careful meetings with the nearest villages, seeking dialogue. "We come with respect," he told the leaders, gestures open. "We seek to live, not to dominate. We can teach, we can learn, but only if trust grows slowly." The local leaders watched cautiously. Eyes sharp, hands ready, words measured. There was curiosity, but no immediate hostility. And yet under that calm there was a constant tension, thin, fragile, like ice over a rushing stream. One false step could shatter it. Meanwhile, inside the settlement, small crises emerged. A hunting party returned with less food than expected. Illness struck a few children. Storms tore through half-built huts. Every setback reminded them that survival was not guaranteed, that this land demanded humility as much as effort. Mary sat by the fire one evening, her hands cupped around a tin cup of water. "Do you think they will trust us?" she asked Thomas. Thomas stared into the flames. "I don't know. But we must show them we can be steady. We must prove ourselves without arrogance, without mistakes." Captain Smith, walking past, overheard. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Careful. Respect, observation, patience. That is all that will keep us alive, that and our own determination, nothing else." The settlers began learning the land's rhythms. Which fish ran in the river at dawn, which roots could be eaten safely, where to place a hut to avoid floods. Every day was a lesson, sometimes harsh, sometimes rewarding. On one such morning, a group of settlers ventured farther into the forest than before. The ground was uneven, moss soft underfoot. Birds startled and took flight with every careful step. Then a sudden noise, a shout, a twig snapped too loudly. Every head turned, eyes darted through trees, and then silence. The settlers froze, hearts pounding. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Hands raised slightly, calm, deliberate, the settlers held their breath. Captain Smith stepped forward slowly, voice steady. "We mean no harm." The figure paused, assessing them, then a subtle nod. Another figure joined from behind a tree, observing, silent, not threatening but vigilant. Communication had begun, delicate and careful, but real. Thomas exhaled slowly. "They are cautious," he whispered. "Yes," Smith said, eyes never leaving the newcomers, "and so must we be. This land teaches respect before it teaches trust. Learn it well." Every encounter left the settlers more aware of their own fragility, but also of their growing skill. They began trading small goods, tools, food, knowledge, never boldly, always cautiously. And in these exchanges, understanding started to form, thin but undeniable. Yet alongside the progress, tension never fully dissipated. Every loud noise, every sudden movement, reminded the settlers that their survival depended on vigilance, humility, and careful observation. The forest did not forgive mistakes, and the river did not tolerate carelessness. Even at night, when fires burned low and shadows stretched long across the muddy banks, the settlers remained alert. Every whisper of the wind through the reeds could signal something important. Every rustle in the trees could carry either danger or opportunity. Days bled into weeks. Huts were repaired and strengthened. Gardens began to yield small crops. Relationships with the local people deepened slightly, measured carefully, every gesture scrutinized. Yet beneath this fragile rhythm, the underlying challenge remained. The land, its original inhabitants, and the settlers' own limitations demanded constant attention, resilience, and humility. And so life at Jamestown continued, a careful dance of labor, observation, learning, and adaptation. The settlers were not conquering, they were negotiating existence. Every small victory, bread baked, hut completed, fish caught, was amplified by the knowledge that the world around them was alive, aware, and often indifferent to human desire. The days were long, exhausting, and filled with uncertainty. But as the sun dipped each evening, painting the river and the forest in gold and shadow, the settlers recognized a subtle truth. This land could be lived with, respected, even cherished. If they approached it with patience, humility, and courage, it would teach them its ways. Captain Smith often reflected in solitude. "We are not the masters," he said to no one but the wind. "We are participants, and if we learn the rules, perhaps we may endure." Morning broke over Jamestown with the soft light brushing against the huts and river. The settlers moved with a rhythm now learned from days of trial and error, each step careful, each movement measured. Every action carried weight because they were not alone in this land. Captain Smith gathered a small group at the edge of the settlement. "Today we venture further," he said. "Observe everything, every plant, every animal, every mark of human activity. And remember, do not assume friendliness where it is not given." Thomas, eager yet cautious, adjusted the strap on his satchel. "Will they follow us?" he asked, glancing toward the tree line. "Perhaps," Smith replied, "and perhaps they will not. Our task is to learn, to respect, and to survive." Nothing more, nothing less. The group entered the forest, soft moss underfoot, branches brushing shoulders, insects buzzing in patterns that made the hair on their necks rise. The sound of water trickling somewhere nearby reminded them of both life and danger. They discovered small signs of habitation, stone tools partially buried, fire pits long cold, footprints in mud. These were clues, hints of the lives lived before their arrival. Smith pointed to each quietly, explaining their possible use, their significance. "See, every mark tells a story. Every object has a purpose, learn it well." By midday, the group reached a clearing where smoke curled lazily from a distant fire. Figures appeared, cautious but deliberate, faces unreadable. They did not shout, they did not flee. They observed, much like the settlers themselves. Thomas swallowed hard. "Do you think they're watching us, testing us?" Smith's eyes narrowed. "They are. And we must respond in kind, calmly, respectfully. Every gesture counts." A brief exchange occurred. Smith stepped forward, hands open, voice low and measured. "We come in peace, we are learning. We mean no harm." The words, simple yet deliberate, carried across the clearing. One figure moved slightly, pointing to the riverbank. Another nodded. Communication was fragile, nonverbal, yet real. Thomas exhaled slowly. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of understanding. It was tentative, but it existed. Returning to the settlement, the group shared their observations. Everyone listened intently, recognizing the subtle lessons. The local people had knowledge that could mean life or death, how to read the river, which plants were safe, when storms would arrive. As the weeks passed, minor conflicts arose. Misunderstandings over resources, missed signals, or mistakes in direction caused tension. Yet each time, communication, patience, and mutual respect prevailed. Slowly, grudging acknowledgement formed between settlers and the original inhabitants. Trust was measured, cautious, earned bit by bit. Meanwhile, life within the settlement continued with relentless demands. Huts required repairs after storms. Gardens had to be tended, protected from both animals and harsh weather. Illness struck occasionally, striking fear into hearts and reminding them of their fragility. Yet with every trial, every minor victory, the settlers adapted. Mary, tending the garden, spoke quietly to Thomas one evening. "We are learning inch by inch. But this land, it humbles us every day." Thomas nodded, watching the river's reflection flicker in the firelight. "Yes, and yet we endure. That counts for something, doesn't it?" The tension never fully lifted. Every shadow in the forest, every rustle of leaves, reminded them of the delicate balance they had to maintain. But alongside the tension, there was a growing rhythm, a fragile human rhythm of survival, learning, and coexistence. One afternoon, a small scouting party returned with news of a nearby village. They had seen figures moving deliberately along a trail, harvesting crops and carrying materials. Communication would have to be careful. Respect and observation had to remain paramount. Every action now carried consequences that extended beyond the settlement itself. Captain Smith called a council of sorts. He gathered the settlers under the shade of a tall tree, the river glinting nearby. "We have learned much," he said, "and yet we must learn more. Observe, respect, adapt. This is the law of this land. Not the law of men, but of life itself. Fail to respect it, and you will fail yourselves." As evening fell, the fires glowed softly across the settlement. The forest seemed quieter now, but no less alive. Insects hummed. The river whispered against its banks. Huts stood sturdily, a testament to the settlers' labor, yet every one of them knew that survival was never guaranteed. Thomas knelt beside a small fire, writing in a crude notebook he had fashioned from bark. He recorded what he had seen, the tracks, the signs, the cautious movements of the local people. Every detail mattered, every observation could mean the difference between life and death in the months to come. Mary placed a hand on his shoulder. "We are learning," she said softly, slowly. "But we are," "Yes," Thomas replied, "slowly, but we are." Night deepened. The The settlers slept in shifts, listening for sounds, learning rhythms. Every night brought new lessons. Every day tested endurance, patience, and courage. Yet despite the tension, there was pride. Every small successful hunt, repair of a hut, understanding a signal from the locals, was magnified by the understanding of their fragility. Captain Smith sat alone by the river under a sky full of stars. "We are not conquerors," he whispered. "We are guests, students of this land, and if we do well, if we respect, we endure." That is all we can ask of ourselves. The settlers of Jamestown understood, in ways words could not capture, that this land demanded respect, humility, and patience. Each person's survival was tied to the others, and to the unseen rhythms of river, forest, and sky. By the end of the season, small gardens produced food. Huts stood strong enough to withstand storms. Relations with local people, cautious but real, had begun. Life, though still precarious, had found a foothold. And so the settlement endured slowly, humanly, imperfectly. The land had tested them. It had challenged them. And they had responded not with arrogance, not with haste, but with patience, courage, and a careful understanding that their survival depended on respect, observation, and resilience. Captain Smith looked over the settlement one last time before night fell. Fires burned, shadows moved. The river reflected both light and shadow. And he allowed himself a rare, deep breath, feeling the weight of accomplishment and the promise of days to come. This was the life they had chosen, difficult, beautiful, demanding, fragile. And it was theirs to shape with care, with courage, and with respect for the land that had first claimed them.
British control and the long road toward independence. 1700 to 1770. By the early 1700s, the settlements no longer felt temporary. They were no longer just camps of survival. They had become communities. Wooden houses replaced crude huts. Dirt paths slowly turned into familiar roads. Children were born who had never seen England, never smelled its rain, never heard its church bells. For them, this land was not new. It was simply home. Yet far across the ocean, decisions were being made for people who would never be asked what they wanted. Ships arrived more regularly now, not just with food or tools, but with papers, orders, rules written in neat handwriting by men who had never walked these forests, never touched this soil, never buried someone here. The British Crown was watching more closely. At first, the control felt distant, almost polite. Taxes were small, laws were simple. Just a reminder, the officials would say, a formality. But formalities have a way of growing teeth. Merchants were told who they could trade with. Farmers were told how much of their harvest belonged to the crown. Shipbuilders were told what kind of ships they could build, and for whom. People grumbled quietly at first, around dinner tables, in taverns after a long day's work. Why do they decide this? Someone would ask. We built this place, another would reply. But complaints stayed low. Survival had taught them caution. As decades passed, the colonies grew stronger, larger, more confident. Cities expanded. Trade increased. Local leaders emerged. People trusted not because of titles, but because they had survived alongside everyone else. And that changed everything. Because strength invites attention, and attention invites control. British officials began arriving in greater numbers. Governors, tax collectors, soldiers in red coats, standing stiff and foreign in towns that no longer felt British in spirit. The laws grew heavier. New taxes were imposed to pay for wars fought an ocean away. Wars the colonists hadn't voted for. Wars they barely understood. When protests rose, the Crown answered not with conversation, but with force. Soldiers were quartered in private homes, boots on wooden floors, foreign voices at family tables. Silence followed. A thick, uncomfortable silence. People began to write letters. Essays passed hand to hand. Words became weapons when weapons were forbidden. One farmer said it plainly in a town meeting. If we obey every order, we are not citizens, we are subjects. The word subjects landed hard. By the 1760s, tension was no longer hidden. It lived in the streets. In the way soldiers watched civilians. In the way civilians stared back. Small confrontations became unavoidable. Arguments over taxes turned into shouting matches. Shouting matches turned into shoves. Shoves turned into blood. Each incident, small on its own, added weight. Pressure. A sense that something could not hold much longer. Still, no one spoke openly of separation. Not yet. Independence was a dangerous word. A reckless word. Most colonists didn't want rebellion. They wanted fairness, a voice, respect. But the crown did not bend. Stricter enforcement. More troops. Ports were closed as punishment. Trade strangled. Families felt it first. Empty shelves, cold winters, unpaid debts. And slowly, quietly, the question began to change. Not, how do we fix this? But, why do we obey this at all? In taverns, men leaned closer when they spoke. Voices dropped. Names were checked before conversations continued. Ideas spread like embers carried by wind. Representation, rights, consent, dangerous ideas. By the early 1770s, unity began forming. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but inevitably. Colonies that once argued among themselves started sharing grievances. Meetings were held in secret. Letters crossed borders. Trust was fragile but growing. British authority, once distant and symbolic, now felt heavy and suffocating. Then came moments that could not be ignored. Moments that felt final. Soldiers firing into crowds. Ports shut down entirely. Punishment without trial. Grief hardened into resolve. A printer, hands stained with ink, said what many were thinking. If they treat us like enemies, perhaps they have already chosen for us. Fear still existed. No one pretended otherwise. The British Empire was powerful, experienced, ruthless when challenged, and yet, so were people with nothing left to lose. By the time whispers of independence became open discussion, something fundamental had already changed. The colonies no longer saw themselves as extensions of Britain. They saw themselves as separate, not fully formed, not unified in every belief, but undeniably different. A people shaped by hardship, by distance, by survival without permission. The road ahead was uncertain, violent, terrifying, but it was no longer unthinkable. As one elder said quietly, after a long meeting, we did not start by wanting to leave. We started by wanting to be heard. They refused to listen, and in that refusal, the future had already begun to shift. 1776, the breaking point and the birth of a nation. By the time the year 1776 arrived, the question was no longer if something would happen. It was how far it would go. The colonies felt like a stretched rope, tight, trembling, ready to snap. British soldiers still stood in towns, their red coats bright against dull streets. Cannons faced ports. Trade was crippled. Families whispered instead of speaking freely. Fear had become ordinary, but something else had grown beside it. Resolve. Meetings were no longer just complaints, they were plans, quiet at first, then louder. Men traveled days on horseback to speak for hours in crowded rooms, knowing full well that treason had a price. Ink-stained fingers passed drafts of ideas that could end lives if discovered. One thought kept returning, again and again. If we do nothing, this never ends. In the summer heat, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The air inside the meeting rooms was heavy, not just with humidity, but with consequence. Some men argued cautiously, some angrily, some barely spoke at all. They were not heroes carved from stone. They were tired, afraid, unsure. Independence meant war. War meant loss. Loss meant everything they had built could vanish. Yet submission meant something worse. Living without a voice. Raising children who would inherit silence. One man, quiet by nature, bent over parchment for days, choosing words as if each one might decide a future. That man was Thomas Jefferson. He did not write like a warrior. He wrote like a man trying to explain a truth that felt inevitable. That all people were born with rights, that governments existed to protect them, and that when they failed, people had the right to change everything. The room went silent as the words were read, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone understood the weight. Signing that document was not symbolic. It was a confession, a declaration that could not be taken back. One by one, names were added. Some hands shook. Some paused mid-air. All knew what they were risking. On July 4th, 1776, the declaration was made public. There were no fireworks yet, no parades, only stunned silence, and then whispers that raced faster than horses. Independence. They've done it. There's no turning back now. Not hesitate.
War followed. Not glorious war, not clean war. It was cold nights,
Bare feet on frozen ground. Gunpowder that ran low. Men who had never been soldiers learning fear the hard way. Victory was uncertain, often unlikely, and yet something held. Because this fight was no longer about taxes. It was about dignity. Years passed in blood and exhaustion before independence was finally secured. When the war ended, celebrations erupted, but they were quieter than expected, because freedom was only the beginning. Now came the harder question. How do we govern ourselves? There was no king to blame anymore. No distant crown. Mistakes would now belong to them alone.
The early years were fragile. The new nation was bound together loosely, more like a promise than a system.
States argued. Money was scarce. Trust was uneven. Some feared chaos. Some feared tyranny reborn in another form. Once again, leaders gathered. Once again, the room filled with tension. This time, the task was different, but just as dangerous. They had to design power without letting it consume itself. Debates stretched late into the night. Arguments flared. Compromises bruised egos. How strong should a central government be? How much freedom could be protected without losing order? How could a nation be powerful without becoming what it had just escaped? Out of exhaustion and persistence, structure slowly emerged. 3 branches, checks and balances, limits written directly into law. The Constitution was not perfect. Even its creators knew that. But it was honest in its intention. It assumed humans were flawed, and built safeguards accordingly. When it was finally signed, there was no certainty, only hope and responsibility. One delegate reportedly said, "We have given you a republic, if you can keep it." That sentence lingered, because the story was no longer about founding a nation. It was about maintaining one. The land that began as an uncertain shoreline had become something unimaginable centuries earlier. Not because it was destined to, but because ordinary people made dangerous choices when silence became unbearable. The night America was almost lost was not a single battle, not a single speech, not a single signature. It was every moment when fear was easier, but courage was chosen anyway. And that choice, imperfect, human, unfinished, became the foundation of everything that followed. Building a nation that had never existed before. 1789 to 1800s. Freedom did not arrive like sunrise. It arrived like a long, uncertain morning. The war was over, but peace felt unfinished. The new nation stood still for a moment, unsure which direction to step. Independence had answered one question: who rules us? But it opened dozens more. Who decides the laws? Who controls the money? Who speaks for whom? The people had won their right to choose. Now they had to live with the consequences of choosing. In the early years, the country felt fragile. States argued like siblings who had escaped a strict parent, but could not agree on what came next. Some wanted strong central authority, others feared it deeply. We did not escape a king, one voice warned, just to build another. Yet without unity, nothing held together. Slowly, painfully, structure formed. A federal government, not too weak, not too strong, at least in theory. The balance was delicate. Every decision felt permanent, even when it wasn't meant to be. And then came a question that was symbolic, but heavy with meaning. Where would the heart of this nation be? After long debate, a new capital was chosen, neither fully northern nor southern, not an old city shaped by colonial memory, but something intentionally new. On swampy land beside a quiet river, planners imagined wide avenues, grand buildings, and a future not yet earned. Washington, D.C. was not impressive at first. It was muddy, half-built, uncomfortable. Lawmakers complained openly. Roads were rough. Buildings leaked. The city felt unfinished because the nation itself was unfinished. But that was the point. Around it, other cities grew quickly. Ports buzzed with trade. Towns turned into hubs of craft, printing, debate.
People moved not because life was easy,
But because possibility pulled harder than fear. With growth came disagreement. Federalists believed a strong central government was the only way to survive in a world of empires. Anti-Federalists worried that distant power would forget ordinary people, just as Britain had. Arguments filled newspapers. Letters crossed states. Friendships strained. These were not polite disagreements. They were loud, personal, and sometimes bitter. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of tearing the nation apart, conflict became normal. Debate was no longer treason. Opposition was not betrayal. It was messy, but it was alive.
still unity was fragile. Money was scarce.
European powers watched closely, some hoping the experiment would fail on its own, and then opportunity arrived. Unexpected, enormous, and risky. Across the continent lay land so vast it was difficult to imagine. Rivers, plains, forests stretching beyond known maps, controlled not by Britain, but by France. The offer came quietly, almost casually. France was willing to sell. Many were stunned, some were alarmed. Buying that land would double the nation's size overnight. But was it legal? Constitutional? Affordable? More importantly, could the country handle it? The debate was fierce. Some saw destiny, others saw disaster. A nation barely standing now asked to stretch itself across a continent. In the end, hesitation gave way to vision. The Louisiana Purchase went through. There was no immediate celebration, only a deep inhale. Because with that decision, the nation changed forever. The map expanded faster than the people could follow, and people did follow. Families packed wagons. Farmers sold what little they had. Young men chased land, opportunity, or escape. This movement westward was not neat or noble. It was desperate, hopeful, often cruel. Settlers faced harsh winters, broken promises, unfamiliar terrain. Many failed, many turned back, many never returned. And the land was not empty. Native nations were pushed aside, ignored, broken by treaties that shifted whenever convenient. Expansion brought growth, but also displacement, suffering, and silence that history would struggle to face honestly. Still, the movement continued, because the idea had taken hold that the nation was not fixed, that it could grow, that the future lived somewhere beyond the horizon. Back east, leaders argued over what this expansion meant. Would new territories become states? Would they have equal power? Would old tensions simply spread westward? The questions had no easy answers. By the early 1800s, the country felt both stronger and more divided. Economies differed. Cultures clashed. Loyalties pulled in different directions. Yet the system held. Barely at times, but it held. People voted, protested, published opinions, lost elections, and survived them.
Power changed hands without bloodshed, something rare in the world at that time.
The nation was not perfect. It was unfinished. But it was real. And beneath every argument, every compromise, every risky decision lived the same understanding. This country was no longer an idea borrowed from somewhere else. It was becoming its own thing, slowly, painfully, humanly. The road ahead would not be calm. Expansion would magnify conflicts already simmering beneath the surface. Questions about power, rights, and identity were far from settled, but the foundation had been laid. A capital rising from mud, a government learning restraint,
a people moving west with hope and ignorance in equal measure.
This was nation building not as legend tells it, but as it truly was. Uncertain, contradictory, expansion, power, and the quiet cracks beneath the nation. Expansion did not feel like celebration when it truly began. It felt like motion, constant, relentless. Wagons rolled west, not in neat lines, but in scattered desperation. Families left behind towns they had helped build. Some left because they wanted more land. Some because they had none left to lose. Some because staying felt heavier than leaving. The road west was not a promise. It was a gamble. Dust coated everything. Wheels broke. Animals collapsed. Children cried from thirst and exhaustion. Nights were cold in ways no one had warned them about. Days burned hotter than imagined. And still they moved. Back east, lawmakers argued over maps and borders. Out west, people argued with nature and often lost. Every mile forward raised new questions that the nation had never answered. Who owned the land? Who had the right to claim it? Who would be protected by law and who would not? The federal government tried to keep up, but it was always reacting, never leading. New territories demanded recognition. Settlers demanded protection. Native nations demanded what they had always demanded, to be left alone. They were ignored. Treaties were signed, then quietly broken. Lines were redrawn. Promises were reinterpreted. Expansion wore the language of opportunity, but its shadow was long and unforgiving. Even those who benefited felt uneasy. A farmer in a new settlement wrote to his brother back east, "This land feeds us, yes, but it feels borrowed, and borrowed things always come due." As new territories formed, the balance of power became impossible to ignore. Each new region meant representation, votes, influence, control. Old arguments returned, stronger now, sharpened by distance. Should the federal government decide everything, or should states rule themselves? Some states feared being drowned out by larger neighbors. Others feared a weak center would tear the nation apart. The Constitution had created a framework, but it had not erased fear. It had only organized it. Political factions hardened into identities. Newspapers no longer debated ideas. They attacked motives. Accusations of betrayal flew freely. Every disagreement was framed as a threat to the nation's soul. And yet the system endured. Power changed hands peacefully. For a time, that felt miraculous. But beneath the surface, contradictions grew. The nation spoke of liberty while denying it to millions. It expanded westward in the name of freedom while crushing those already there. It praised unity while deepening division. People felt it, even if they could not yet name it. In western settlements, neighbors argued over laws they barely understood. In eastern cities, politicians argued over people they would never meet. The distance between decision and consequence stretched thin. Still, growth continued. Canals were built. Roads carved through wilderness. Trade expanded. Cities swelled with immigrants chasing the same uncertain promise earlier settlers once chased. The country looked stronger from the outside. Inside, it was learning how fragile strength could be. A young man traveling west wrote in his journal, "We call this progress, but progress feels loud. It breaks things. I wonder what will remain when it slows." The federal government tried compromise after compromise. Balance this interest, calm that fear, delay the hard decisions. Because some questions felt too dangerous to answer directly, especially one. Could a nation built on freedom survive while denying freedom? No law could silence that question forever. As the years passed, regional identities hardened. North and South began to speak different political languages. West looked forward, East looked inward. Each believed it carried the nation's future. They were all partly right, and dangerously wrong. Yet, for all its tension, the country did not collapse. Not yet. Because everyday life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, towns celebrated holidays, people married, argued, forgave, and forgot. Just enough to keep moving. History rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels ordinary. Heavy, but manageable. That was the illusion. By the time leaders began openly acknowledging the cracks, they were already deep. Expansion had given the nation size, but it had also magnified every unresolved contradiction. The land was vast, the unity was not. And still, people believed. They believed the system could adapt. They believed debate was better than violence. They believed tomorrow would fix what today could not. Those beliefs held the nation together, longer than anyone expected. But they were under strain. By the end of this chapter, the United States stood larger, louder, and more powerful than ever before. It had survived rebellion, foreign pressure, and internal conflict. But it carried unfinished business in its bones. The road ahead would demand answers no compromise could soften. And the cost of delay would soon become impossible to ignore. For now, the wagons kept rolling. The cities kept growing. The government kept negotiating. And the nation, still young, still imperfect, moved forward, unaware that the next great test would not come from expansion, but from within. Expansion, power, and the quiet cracks beneath the nation. Expansion did not feel like celebration when it truly began. It felt like motion, constant, relentless. Wagons rolled west, not in neat lines, but in scattered desperation. Families left behind towns they had helped build. Some left because they wanted more land. Some because they had none left to lose. Some because staying felt heavier than leaving. The road west was not a promise. It was a gamble. Dust coated everything. Wheels broke. Animals collapsed. Children cried from thirst and exhaustion. Nights were cold in ways no one had warned them about. Days burned hotter than imagined. And still they moved. Back east, lawmakers argued over maps and borders. Out west, people argued with nature, and often lost. Every mile forward raised new questions that the nation had never answered. Who owned the land? Who had the right to claim it? Who would be protected by law, and who would not? The federal government tried to keep up, but it was always reacting, never leading. New territories demanded recognition. Settlers demanded protection. Native nations demanded what they had always demanded, to be left alone. They were ignored. Treaties were signed, then quietly broken. Lines were redrawn. Promises were reinterpreted. Expansion wore the language of opportunity, but its shadow was long and unforgiving. Even those who benefited felt uneasy. A farmer in a new settlement wrote to his brother back east, "This land feeds us, yes, but it feels borrowed, and borrowed things always come due." As new territories formed, the balance of power became impossible to ignore. Each new region meant representation, votes, influence, control. Old arguments returned, stronger now, sharpened by distance. Should the federal government decide everything, or should states rule themselves? Some states feared being drowned out by larger neighbors. Others feared a weak center would tear the nation apart. The Constitution had created a framework, but it had not erased fear. It had only organized it. Political factions hardened into identities. Newspapers no longer debated ideas. They attacked motives. Accusations of betrayal flew freely. Every disagreement was framed as a threat to the nation's soul. And yet the system endured. Power changed hands peacefully. For a time, that felt miraculous. But beneath the surface, contradictions grew. The nation spoke of liberty while denying it to millions. It expanded westward in the name of freedom while crushing those already there. It praised unity while deepening division. People felt it, even if they could not yet name it. In western settlements, neighbors argued over laws they barely understood. In eastern cities, politicians argued over people they would never meet. The distance between decision and consequence stretched thin. Still, growth continued. Canals were built. Roads carved through wilderness. Trade expanded. Cities swelled with immigrants chasing the same uncertain promise earlier settlers once chased. The country looked stronger from the outside. Inside, it was learning how fragile strength could be. A young man traveling west wrote in his journal, "We call this progress, but progress feels loud. It breaks things. I wonder what will remain when it slows." The federal government tried compromise after compromise. Balance this interest, calm that fear, delay the hard decisions. Because some questions felt too dangerous to answer directly, especially one. Could a nation built on freedom survive while denying freedom? No law could silence that question forever. As the years passed, regional identities hardened. North and South began to speak different political languages. West looked forward, East looked inward. Each believed it carried the nation's future. They were all partly right, and dangerously wrong. Yet, for all its tension, the country did not collapse. Not yet. Because everyday life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, towns celebrated holidays, people married, argued, forgave, and forgot. Just enough to keep moving. History rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels ordinary. Heavy, but manageable. That was the illusion. By the time leaders began openly acknowledging the cracks, they were already deep. Expansion had given the nation size, but it had also magnified every unresolved contradiction. The land was vast, the unity was not. And still, people believed. They believed the system could adapt. They believed debate was better than violence. They believed tomorrow would fix what today could not. Those beliefs held the nation together, longer than anyone expected. But they were under strain. By the end of this chapter, the United States stood larger, louder, and more powerful than ever before. It had survived rebellion, foreign pressure, and internal conflict. But it carried unfinished business in its bones. The road ahead would demand answers no compromise could soften. And the cost of delay would soon become impossible to ignore. For now, the wagons kept rolling. The cities kept growing. The government kept negotiating. And the nation, still young, still imperfect, moved forward, unaware that the next great test would not come from expansion, but from within. A nation under pressure, conflict, change, and unanswered questions, 1800 to 1850. By the early 1800s, the country no longer felt young. It felt restless. It had grown too fast, stretched itself too wide, and promised more than it yet understood how to give. From the outside, it looked confident, cities expanding, trade flowing, borders pushing outward. From the inside, it felt strained. People were arriving in waves, ships filled with families who carried little more than language, memory, and hunger. They came from places broken by war, poverty, or silence. They came believing this land would listen. The cities changed first. Crowded streets, shared rooms, long hours of work that bent bodies and spirits alike. The promise of opportunity existed, but it was uneven, fragile, and often delayed. Some who had arrived generations earlier watched with suspicion. They don't speak like us. They don't worship like us. They will change everything. And they were right. Immigration reshaped the nation in ways no law could fully control. New voices entered politics. New traditions filled neighborhoods. Tension rose between those who feared losing influence and those who had never possessed it. The idea of who belongs became harder to answer. Meanwhile, the economy lurched forward unevenly. Booms came fast. Crashes came faster. Farmers lost land. Workers lost wages. Banks collapsed quietly, taking savings with them. Each collapse left scars. A man who lost his shop during one financial panic wrote, "They say the nation is growing richer. I wish it would tell my children." Economic hardship did not unite people. It divided them. Some demanded reform, others demanded order. Politicians argued over responsibility, while families argued over dinner they could barely afford. And beneath all of it lay a contradiction too large to ignore. Freedom was celebrated loudly, but it was not shared equally. The question had lingered for decades. Now it refused to stay quiet. As new territories formed, arguments erupted, not just over borders, but over values. What would be allowed? What would be protected? What could be postponed? Every compromise bought time, but time came with interest. States accused each other of overreach. Federal authority was challenged openly. Laws were tested in courts and in streets. The Constitution, once seen as a solution, became a battleground of interpretation. What did it mean? Who decided? These were not academic debates. They shaped lives. And when diplomacy failed, violence followed. Not always officially. Sometimes it came as riots, sometimes as armed standoffs, sometimes as quiet intimidation that never made it into records. The nation learned something uncomfortable. Conflict did not always arrive wearing uniforms. Wars also came from beyond its borders. Not all were grand, defining struggles, but each one revealed weakness, poor coordination, conflicting priorities. Leaders divided by ideology rather than strategy. Every war left veterans. Every veteran returned to a nation that did not always know what to do with them. The cost of expansion, of ambition, of unresolved values was becoming harder to deny. And yet the country did not stop. It argued, fought, adapted, and argued again. Some believed the system was strong enough to absorb any shock. Others feared it was merely delaying a reckoning. New amendments were discussed. Rights were clarified, sometimes expanded, sometimes restricted. Each change was fought over intensely because everyone understood something vital. Once written into law, ideas become real. By mid-century, the pressure was unmistakable. Conversations grew sharper, newspapers grew louder, trust between regions thinned. People still believed in the nation, but not always in each other. A teacher wrote to a friend, "I tell my students we are one people. They ask me what that means. I do not always know how to answer." That uncertainty spread. Yet daily life continued, as it always does. Children learned. Workers labored. Families planned futures, with whatever hope they could afford. History did not announce what was coming next, but the signs were everywhere. The nation had survived birth. It had survived growth. Now it faced something more dangerous. It had to survive itself. When the nation turned on itself, 1850 to 1900. By the middle of the 1800s, the tension was no longer something people argued about. It was something they lived with. Conversations stopped midway. Friendships ended quietly. Families avoided certain words at the dinner table. Because everyone knew, somewhere beneath the daily routines, something was breaking. Compromise had been the nation's favorite tool. Delay the hard choice. Soften the sharp edge. Promise that tomorrow would be calmer. But compromise has limits. Each new agreement felt thinner than the last. Each delay made the eventual reckoning heavier. The question that had haunted the country since its founding now stood in the open, unavoidable. What does freedom mean if it is not shared? People chose sides, sometimes without realizing when it happened. Not always out of hatred, often out of fear. Fear of losing identity. Fear of losing everything they had been taught was normal. Political debates turned personal. Personal disagreements turned dangerous. Then, slowly at first, the unthinkable became possible. War, not against a foreign empire, but against itself. When it finally came, it did not feel heroic. It felt like shock. Brothers stood on opposite sides. Neighbors wore different uniforms. Young men marched away unsure if they would ever see home again. The war did not ask permission. It took what it needed. Cities emptied. Farms went untended. Mothers learned the sound of footsteps that meant news had arrived, and feared it. Battles were loud, chaotic, merciless. But the quiet moments were worse. The waiting, the letters that stopped coming, the names read aloud. The nation paid for its unanswered questions in blood. When the fighting finally ended, there was no clean relief, only exhaustion. The land was scarred. The people were scarred. Trust was broken in ways laws could not immediately repair. And yet, something had changed. The war had answered a question the country could no longer avoid. But answers do not heal on their own. The years after were called Reconstruction, but nothing about them felt simple.
The challenge was not just rebuilding roads or buildings.
It was rebuilding belief. Who was protected now? Who counted as a citizen? Who would enforce these promises? New amendments were written into the Constitution. Words meant to correct centuries of exclusion. On paper, they were powerful. In reality, they were fragile, because laws require will, and will was uneven. Some embraced change. Others resisted it openly. Old habits fought to survive. New freedoms were tested, challenged, delayed. Violence did not disappear with the war. It changed form. Intimidation replaced armies. Silence replaced chains. The nation moved forward, but unevenly, painfully. Meanwhile, the country continued to industrialize. Machines replaced hands. Cities grew upward and outward.
Wealth accumulated quickly,
But not evenly. Factories roared, workers endured, children labored where childhood should have lived. Another kind of conflict emerged, not over unity, but over survival. Strikes, protests, crackdowns, the question shifted again. Who does this nation work for? Immigrants arrived in even greater numbers now, feeding the factories, building railroads, filling tenements. They were needed and resented at the same time. The pattern repeated. Fear of change, anger at difference, blame placed downward instead of upward. Yet through all of this, something remarkable persisted. The system, flawed, strained, imperfect, did not collapse. Courts ruled, elections happened, power shifted. Not always fairly, not always cleanly, but without descending into constant chaos. That mattered, because history is not just about ideals. It is about endurance. By the late 1800s, the United States was no longer unsure of its survival. It was unsure of its soul. It had proven it could fight. It had proven it could grow. Now it faced a quieter challenge. Could it live with the consequences of its own choices? People argued about the past, about what the war had meant, about who had been right. But the future did not wait. Children born after the conflict inherited a nation still arguing with itself. A constitution amended, but still contested. Freedoms declared, but unevenly practiced. And yet, hope remained. Not loud hope, not perfect hope, but stubborn hope. The kind that shows up anyway. The kind that keeps people voting, working, questioning. The kind that refuses to let the story end in failure. By 1900, the nation stood transformed. Larger, more powerful, more complicated. It had survived internal war, economic collapse, mass migration, and moral reckoning. It carried scars it would never fully erase, but it was still standing. Not because it had all the answers, but because it kept confronting the questions. That was the cost. And the promise. The night America was almost lost did not pass once. It returned again and again, and each time the nation chose, sometimes wisely, sometimes not, to keep going. Imperfect, human, unfinished. The modern age begins. Industry, speed, and a new identity, 1900 to 1930. By the turn of the century, America no longer looked inward by default. It had survived division. It had endured war with itself. Now it was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. Speed. Cities no longer grew slowly. They rose. Steel climbed skyward where wood once stood. Streets filled with noise. Machines, engines, voices layered over each other without pause. Factories worked day and night. The rhythm of life changed. Time was no longer measured by sunlight or seasons, but by shifts, whistles, and clocks. People felt it in their bodies. Hands hardened, lungs burned, sleep shortened. The future arrived faster than anyone had learned how to process. Rural families moved towards cities, believing opportunity lived where smoke curled into the sky. Immigrants poured in, carrying languages that crowded streets with unfamiliar sounds. Neighborhoods changed almost overnight. Some embraced it, some feared it, but no one could ignore it. America was becoming industrial, not just in machinery, but in mindset. Efficiency mattered, speed mattered, output mattered. And people? People tried to keep up. A factory worker wrote in a letter home, "I earn more than my father ever did. I am also more tired than I thought a man could be." Wealth accumulated quickly at the top. Enormous fortunes appeared almost overnight. Mansions rose beside slums. Opportunity existed, but it was uneven, unpredictable, and often brutal. The nation praised progress loudly, but progress did not ask permission. Children worked, workers were injured. Voices calling for reform grew louder. Strikes erupted, some peaceful. The question shifted again, as it always did in American history. Who benefits and who pays? The government struggled to respond. Too much control felt dangerous. Too little felt cruel. Laws came slowly, often after damage had already been done. Still, change moved forward. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Telegraph lines shrank distance. Trains stitched the continent tighter than ever before. News traveled faster than truth sometimes could. America felt powerful, but unsettled. Then the world knocked. War in distant lands at first seemed like someone else's problem. The nation watched cautiously, divided between involvement and isolation. Memories of internal bloodshed had not faded easily. Let Europe solve its own problems, many said. We have enough of our own. But distance meant less now. Trade tied economies together. News arrived daily. Neutrality grew harder to maintain. When the nation finally stepped into global conflict, it did so reluctantly, and decisively. Young men crossed oceans they had never imagined seeing. Families watched ships disappear over the horizon, unsure what would return. The war was unlike anything Americans had known: industrialized, mechanized, impersonal. Death moved faster than courage could keep up with. When it ended, the country returned changed. Not broken, but altered. America emerged wealthier, more confident, and more aware of its influence. It could no longer pretend to be just another former colony finding its way. The world was watching now. The 1920s arrived with a strange energy. Relief mixed with ambition. The nation exhaled and then rushed forward. Music filled clubs, radios entered homes, movies flickered across screens, shaping dreams and identities. Cars transformed distance again, shrinking the country emotionally and physically. People danced. They spent. They believed. For a moment it felt like the future had arrived and was smiling. But beneath the surface, cracks formed quietly. Speculation replaced stability. Credit replaced savings. Confidence outpaced caution. Warnings were ignored because belief felt better than restraint. A banker reportedly said, "This time is different."
History rarely agrees with that sentence.
By the end of the decade, the momentum faltered. Markets trembled. Trust evaporated. Fortunes vanished faster than they had appeared. What followed was not just economic collapse. It was psychological shock. Jobs disappeared. Lines formed. The same nation that had believed itself unstoppable now faced hunger, uncertainty, and fear. Once again, Americans asked themselves a familiar question: what do we owe each other? The government responded differently this time. Intervention replaced distance. Programs replaced promises. The relationship between people and power shifted again. Some welcomed help. Some feared dependence. The debate was fierce, but survival demanded action. Communities adapted. Families leaned on each other. Neighbors shared when they could. Dignity bent, but did not vanish. Through hardship, the nation learned something vital. Strength was not just expansion or wealth. It was resilience. It was adjustment. By the early 1930s, America stood tired. It had tasted modernity at full speed and learned its cost. And beyond its borders, storms were gathering again. The world was changing. Ideologies were hardening. Another test was forming. America did not yet know it, but the next chapter would demand more than industry, more than reform. It would demand sacrifice on a scale the modern world had never seen. And once again the nation would have to decide, not who it was born to be, but who it was willing to become. Depression, World War, and the weight of global power, 1930-1945. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It crept in. A factory closed here. A paycheck vanished there. Then suddenly, entire streets were quiet in the middle of the day. Men who had built cities stood in lines that wrapped around corners, hats pulled low, eyes fixed on the ground, pride folded inward. The Great Depression was not just an economic event. It was a test of spirit. Families learned new meanings of enough. Meals grew smaller. Dreams grew quieter. Parents told children stories not to entertain, but to distract from hunger. The government stepped in more than it ever had before. Programs were built quickly, imperfectly. Some helped, some failed. All were debated. Was this rescue or overreach? People argued, but most understood one thing clearly. Doing nothing was no longer an option. Slowly, very slowly, the nation stabilized. Not healed, stabilized. Enough to breathe again. And then, once more, the world intruded. At first, the warnings felt distant. Conflicts overseas, borders shifting, speeches delivered in languages many Americans did not speak, like problems that belonged to someone else. "We've seen this before," people said. "Let them handle it." Isolation felt safe, logical, earned. But history does not respect distance anymore, once machines learned to cross oceans. News arrived daily, refugees spoke of horrors, economies trembled again. A silence of inaction began to feel heavier than the fear of involvement. Then, the moment came, sudden, violent, undeniable. A quiet morning, a distant base, and then fire. America was pulled into war not by choice, but by shock. The response was immediate. Factories roared back to life. Assembly lines moved with purpose. The same industrial power that had once exhausted workers now fueled survival. Men enlisted. Women stepped into roles they had been denied. Communities reorganized overnight. The war touched everything. Letters crossed oceans. Some arrived stained with rain. Some never arrived at all. Radios carried voices that became part of daily ritual. Updates, warnings, hope wrapped in static. The fighting was vast. Multiple fronts. Endless logistics. Death measured in numbers too large to imagine properly. Yet the war was not only fought abroad. At home, freedoms tightened. Suspicion grew. Fear made people look sideways at neighbors. Not all sacrifices were shared equally. Still, the nation held. When the war finally ended, relief washed over the world like exhaustion finally allowed to rest. Celebration erupted, but it was quieter than movies would later show, because everyone knew what had been lost. America emerged changed again. Stronger, undeniably. Richer, certainly, but also heavier. The country was no longer just a participant in world affairs, it had become central to them. Its decisions rippled outward. Power settled like a responsibility no one had trained for. Soldiers came home carrying memories they could not easily explain. Cities expanded again. Families tried to return to normal, but normal had shifted. The world now looked to United States not as an experiment, but as a leader. That attention was uncomfortable. New alliances formed. New tensions followed. The line between peace and preparation blurred. Weapons became more destructive. Fear became more abstract and more constant. At home, prosperity returned unevenly. Suburbs expanded. Television entered living rooms, shaping a shared imagination. The nation told itself a story of victory and progress. But beneath that story lived questions that never fully went away. How much power is too much? How much fear justifies control? How do you protect freedom without becoming afraid of it? These questions did not explode. They lingered. By 1945, America stood at a place it had never been before. Not a colony, not a fragile union, not a divided nation at war with itself, but a global force. The journey from a muddy shoreline to this moment had been long, painful, and unfinished. Every solution created new problems, and yet one truth remained constant. America did not move forward because it was perfect. It moved forward because it kept confronting itself. Sometimes late, sometimes clumsily, sometimes at terrible cost. The night America was almost lost had returned many times by now. In hunger, in division, in war. Each time the country survived, not unchanged, not innocent, but alive. And that survival carried a responsibility. The next chapters would not be about becoming a nation. They would be about living as one, under the weight of history, power, and choice.